A desperate Apache begged for milk for his baby from the most rejected woman in the village. No one expected what she would do next. The wind cut through Millbrook County like a blade that night, carrying the bitter promise of the harshest February anyone could remember. In the shadow of the Appalachian foothills, where coal dust still stained the memories of better times, Margaret Chen sat alone in the cabin that had become both her prison and her sanctuary. The wood-burning stove wheezed against the cold, its orange glow the only warmth in a place the town had decided should remain frozen in time. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Let's keep going. 5 years had passed since the accident at the mine. 5 years since the explosion that took 12 good men and left the town of Cedar Falls searching for someone to blame. Margaret, the safety inspector who had signed off on the equipment just days before, became their answer. Never mind that. The real cause lay buried beneath layers of corporate negligence and cost-cutting measures, too complex for grief to unravel. A scapegoat was simpler, cleaner. A woman with an Asian surname in a town that had never learned to see past its own reflection was perfect. The cabin sat 3 miles outside town limits, connected to the main road by a dirt path that turned to mud whenever it rained. Margaret had bought it with the last of her savings after the death threat started, after her windows were broken twice in 1 week, after the grocery store clerk began pretending not to see her when she approached the counter. The isolation was supposed to be temporary, just until emotions cooled and rational thinking returned. But emotions, she had learned, had a way of calcifying into permanent fact. Tonight, the wind carried more than cold. It brought the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the snow that had begun falling an hour before sunset. Margaret's hand instinctively moved to the baseball bat she kept beside her reading chair, though she had never used it for anything more threatening than killing spiders. The footsteps stopped at her door. The knocking came in 3 sharp raps, urgent but not aggressive. Margaret waited, holding her breath. No one knocked on her door. The mail carrier left packages at the gate. The propane delivery man honked his horn and waited for her to come outside. In 5 years, not a single person from Cedar Falls had crossed her threshold. 3 more raps, softer this time, almost pleading. Margaret approached the door with caution, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. Through the thin curtain covering the window, she could make out a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a heavy winter coat. The figure swayed slightly, as if struggling to remain upright. "Who's there?" she called through the door, her voice rusty from disuse. The response came as a whisper, barely audible above the wind. "Please." The single word carried such weight of exhaustion that Margaret found herself reaching for the deadbolt before rational thought could stop her. She paused, hand trembling on the cold metal. This could be a trap. Another cruel game designed to drive her further from a community that had already forgotten her humanity. But something in that whispered plea spoke to a part of her that 5 years of isolation hadn't managed to kill. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was someone she recognized but had never spoken to, Jake Morrison, who worked at the hardware store and coached Little League on weekends. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his face drawn with a kind of desperation that seemed to have aged him years in a single night. But it was what he carried that stopped Margaret's heart. Wrapped in a threadbare baby blanket, so small it could fit in a shoebox, was an infant. The child couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, its skin pale and mottled, tiny fists clenched against the cold. As Margaret watched, the baby's chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths that spoke of distress. "I didn't know where else to go," Jake said, his voice cracking. "The hospital in Charleston is 3 hours away, and with this storm..." He gestured helplessly at the swirling snow that was already beginning to accumulate on Margaret's porch. Margaret's mind raced, trying to piece together what wasn't being said. Whose baby? Jake's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to let fall. My daughter Sarah's. She's only 16 and she's been hiding this for months. The baby came too early and Sarah, He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Margaret understood. The father. Gone. Some college boy who was just passing through last summer. Jake's jaw tightened. Sarah won't tell me his name, and honestly, I don't want to know right now. All I know is this baby needs help, and you're the only person I know who might have the skills. Margaret stared at him in confusion. I'm not a doctor, Jake. I'm a safety inspector. Was a safety inspector. But you were a medic in the army before you came to work at the mine. Jake's research surprised her. Most people in Cedar Falls had never bothered to learn anything about her background beyond the convenient narrative that made her an outsider. My brother Danny was in your unit in Afghanistan. He told me once how you saved half his squad when their convoy hit an IED. The memory hit Margaret like a physical blow. Danny Morrison, that was a name she hadn't heard in years. A quiet kid from West Virginia who never complained, not even when shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had turned his left leg into hamburger meat. She had worked on him for 40 minutes in the back of a Humvee, using nothing but field supplies and stubborn determination to keep him alive until they reached the field hospital. Danny never came home, Jake continued, reading the recognition in her eyes. He made it through 3 more tours, but the pills they gave him for the pain, well, you know how that story ends. But before he died, he used to talk about you. Said you were the best medic he ever saw. Said you had hands that could bring people back from the edge. Margaret felt the old familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the same weight that had driven her to check and recheck the mine equipment 1 more time than regulations required. The same weight that had made her the perfect scapegoat when everything went wrong anyway. Jake, I haven't practiced medicine in over a decade, and even if I could help bringing the baby here, people will talk. They'll say I'm trying to, I don't know, steal your grandchild or something equally ridiculous. Let them talk. Jake's voice carried a strength she hadn't expected. Right now, I don't care what this town thinks. I care about this baby living through the night, and you're the only chance we have. As if summoned by his words, the infant began to cry, a thin, reedy sound that spoke of hunger and cold and something deeper. Margaret looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and completely helpless, and felt something crack open inside her chest. It was the first time in 5 years that someone had needed her for something other than blame. Bring the baby inside, she said, stepping back from the door. Quickly, before we both freeze to death. Jake stumbled forward gratefully, and Margaret closed the door behind him, turning the deadbolt with a decisive click. As she did, she caught a glimpse of headlights in the distance moving slowly down the main road toward town. Someone had seen Jake's truck parked at the end of her driveway. By morning, all of Cedar Falls would know that the town pariah had received a midnight visitor. But as Margaret looked at the infant in Jake's arms, watching those impossibly tiny fingers flex against the blanket, she found she didn't care. For the first time in 5 years, something other than survival was demanding her attention. Something that mattered more than her own safety, more than the comfortable numbness she had wrapped around herself like armor. The baby's cries grew, stronger, more insistent, and Margaret felt herself moving into action with a certainty she hadn't experienced since her army days. Whatever came next, whatever price she would have to pay for opening her door tonight, it would be worth it. Because sometimes salvation comes disguised as someone else's emergency, and grace arrives in the form of a problem only you can solve. Margaret's hands moved with a precision that surprised her, muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. She cleared the kitchen table with swift efficiency, spreading clean towels across its surface, while Jake stood in the doorway, still holding the crying infant. The baby's distress was evident in every shallow breath, every weak flutter of movement beneath the worn blanket. "Set the baby down here," Margaret instructed, her voice taking on the calm authority she had used in field hospitals half a world away. "Gently, and we need more light." Jake carefully placed his grandchild on the makeshift examination table, while Margaret gathered every lamp in the cabin, creating a circle of warm illumination around the tiny patient. As the light fell across the baby's face, she could see what Jake had been too frightened to acknowledge. This child was in serious trouble. The infant's skin had a bluish tinge around the lips and fingernails, a sign that not enough oxygen was reaching the bloodstream. The breathing was rapid and labored, tiny ribs retracting with each breath in a way that spoke of respiratory distress. Margaret had seen this before, in premature babies born in field conditions, when proper medical equipment was nothing but a distant dream. "How early?" she asked, her hands gently unwrapping the blanket to assess the baby's condition more thoroughly. "Sarah thinks maybe 6 weeks." She wasn't sure about dates, kept hoping it would all just go away. Jake's voice carried the weight of a father's helplessness. "When the contractions started this afternoon, she tried to hide it. I only found out when her water broke at dinner." Margaret nodded, her attention focused. On the examination, the baby was tiny, but not critically underweight, perhaps 5 pounds, she estimated. The real concern was the labored breathing and the slight fever she could feel radiating from the small body. Without proper medical intervention, respiratory distress syndrome could be fatal in premature infants. Where is Sarah now? At the clinic in town with Dr. Patterson. She lost a lot of blood, and Jake's voice trailed off. "She made me promise to take the baby somewhere safe. Said if anything happened to her, she didn't want the baby ending up in the system." The implication hung heavy in the air. Sarah Morrison was fighting for her own life while her baby struggled with each breath on Margaret's kitchen table. 2 generations balanced on the edge of loss, and somehow Margaret had become the fulcrum on which their fate would turn. "I need to fashion an incubator," Margaret said, her mind racing through possibilities. "And we need to keep the baby's temperature stable while addressing the breathing issues." She moved through her cabin like a woman possessed, gathering supplies from drawers and closets she hadn't opened in months. A large plastic storage container became the base. Towels and blankets provided insulation. A heating pad, carefully wrapped and positioned, would maintain temperature. For humidity, she filled shallow pans with warm water and placed them inside the makeshift incubator. "Jake, I need you to boil water, lots of it, and find something we can use to create steam, a pot with a tight-fitting lid, anything that will hold heat." While Jake worked, Margaret continued her assessment. The baby's fontanelle, the soft spot on top of the skull, was slightly sunken, indicating dehydration. The tiny fingernails were pale, suggesting poor circulation. But the baby's responses to touch were good, and the heart rate, while fast, was strong. "Tell me about Sarah's pregnancy," Margaret said as she worked. "Any complications? Did she see a doctor at all?" Jake's face darkened. "She hid it for months, wore loose clothes, said she was gaining weight from stress eating. I should have noticed, should have paid better attention, but with Rebecca, my wife, passing last year and trying to keep the store afloat." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "Sarah's been the one taking care of everything. I never thought to question why she was always tired, always wearing those big sweaters." Margaret felt a familiar pang of recognition. Another family torn, apart by circumstances beyond their control. Another series of small decisions that had led to crisis. She had been the same age as Sarah when she enlisted in the army, desperate to escape a home where her stepfather's drinking had turned every day into a battlefield. Some people ran toward danger to escape what felt like greater danger at home. "The baby needs to be fed," Margaret said, assembling a makeshift feeding system from a small spoon and a clean cloth. "Do you have formula? Milk? There's some powdered formula in my truck. Sarah bought it last week but was too scared to bring it in the house." Jake looked sheepish. "I think she was hoping if she didn't prepare for the baby, it somehow wouldn't be real." "Get it." "And Jake," Margaret caught his attention as he headed for the door. "When you go outside, look around. Make sure no one followed you here." Jake nodded grimly. They both knew that by now news of his late-night visit would be spreading through Cedar Falls like wildfire. The town's rumor mill operated on the principle that any deviation from normal routine was potential scandal, and a midnight visit to the exiled former mine inspector would provide fuel for speculation for weeks. While Jake retrieved the formula, Margaret focused on the baby's immediate needs. Using techniques she had learned in Army field hospitals, she created a small oxygen tent from plastic sheeting and the steam from Jake's boiling water. It wasn't sophisticated, but it would help ease the respiratory distress until they could figure out a more permanent solution. The baby's cries had weakened to small whimpers, which worried Margaret more than the original loud protests. Weak cries in premature infants often indicated exhaustion, a sign that the baby was running out of energy to fight for each breath. She needed to act quickly. When Jake returned with the formula, his expression was grim. 2 trucks drove by while I was at mine, slowed down but didn't stop, words getting out. Margaret mixed the formula with careful precision, testing the temperature on her wrist the way she had learned during her pediatric rotation in medical school. Another lifetime, another version of herself that she had nearly forgotten existed. The baby took the formula eagerly, tiny hands instinctively grasping at the makeshift feeding tube Margaret had created. "That's good," she murmured, watching the infant's color begin to improve slightly. "Feeding well is a good sign." As they worked together in the circle of lamplight, Margaret found herself studying Jake's face. The hardware store owner had always seemed like a solid, unremarkable man, the kind of person who showed up to town meetings, paid his taxes on time, and minded his own business. But tonight, she saw something else in his weathered features. The same desperate determination she had witnessed in soldiers fighting to save wounded comrades. "Why did you really come to me, Jake?" Margaret asked quietly. "The nearest hospital is in Charleston, yes, but there are people closer who could have helped. Mrs. Henderson was a nurse for 30 years. Dr. Patterson has an emergency kit." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on his grandchild's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you're the only person in this town who knows what it's like to be blamed for something that wasn't your fault." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. For 5 years, she had believed that everyone in Cedar Falls saw her as the villain in the mine disaster story. She had never considered that some people might understand the difference between being responsible and being blamed. "The mine disaster wasn't your fault," Jake continued. "Everyone with half a brain knows that. The real responsibility lies with Consolidated Mining Corporation and their lawyers who buried the safety reports. But it was easier to blame you than to fight a company with unlimited legal resources." Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time in years. "Then why did everyone—" "Because you were convenient, because you were different, because sometimes people need someone to blame, and you were the only target that wouldn't fight back with an army of lawyers." Jake's voice carried a bitterness that surprised her. "I should have spoken up then. We all should have. But speaking up requires courage, and most of us had used up our courage just getting through each day." The baby made a small sound halfway, between a sigh and a whimper, drawing both adults' attention back to the immediate crisis. Margaret checked the makeshift incubator's temperature and adjusted the humidity levels, watching as the infant's breathing seemed to grow slightly easier. "The respiratory distress is improving," she reported. "But we're not out of the woods yet. Premature babies can develop complications quickly and without proper medical equipment." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the risks. They both understood that they were playing a dangerous game with the highest possible stakes. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls and the snow continued to fall. By morning, the road to Charleston might be impassable, but more immediately threatening than weather was the growing certainty that Cedar Falls would not allow this night to pass unnoticed or unjudged. Margaret looked at Jake, at the baby fighting, for each breath, at the warm circle of light they had created against the darkness. For the first time in 5 years, she was no longer alone with her exile. For better or worse, she had become part of someone else's story, and they had become part of hers. Dawn broke grey and cold over Cedar Falls, revealing a world transformed by overnight snow. Margaret had not slept, spending the dark hours monitoring the baby's breathing, adjusting temperature controls, and feeding the infant every 2 hours. Jake had dozed fitfully in the chair beside the kitchen table, starting awake each time the baby made a sound. At first light, they heard the trucks. 3 vehicles moved slowly down the dirt road toward Margaret's cabin, their engines rumbling low and deliberate. Margaret peered through the front window, recognizing the lead truck as belonging to Tom Wheeler, the current mine foreman and unofficial spokesman for Cedar Falls' more vocal residents. Behind him followed vehicles she didn't recognize, but their purposeful approach left little doubt about their intentions. "They're coming to take the baby," Jake said, his voice flat with resigned certainty. "Tom's been stirring up trouble about you for years. He won't let this opportunity pass." Margaret felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, but alongside it rose something unexpected, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. Over the past 8 hours, she had invested more emotional energy in keeping this tiny stranger alive than she had in her own survival for the past 5 years. "The baby isn't stable enough to move," she said firmly. "The respiratory distress has improved, but sudden temperature changes or unnecessary handling could trigger another episode. Medically speaking, travel would be dangerous." Since when do medical facts matter to Tom Wheeler? The vehicle stopped at the end of the driveway, engines idling. Margaret counted 6 men, including Tom Wheeler and his brother-in-law, Deputy Sheriff Carl Rodriguez. The others were faces she recognized from town but couldn't name, the kind of men who gathered at the hardware store coffee counter every morning to solve the world's problems with righteous indignation and selective memory. Jake stood and walked to the window, his jaw set with determination. "I'll handle this." "No." Margaret's voice carried an authority that stopped him mid-step. "You can't fight them alone, and if you try, they'll use it as proof that something inappropriate is happening here. Let me talk to them." "Margaret, you don't understand how much they hate." "I understand perfectly, but right now, I'm the only thing standing between that baby and whatever Tom Wheeler has planned." Margaret checked the infant one more time. Temperature stable, breathing easier, color improved. "And I'm also the only person here with legal grounds to refuse entry to my property." Jake started to protest, but a sharp knock on the door cut him off. Margaret smoothed her hair, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door with a confidence she didn't feel. Tom Wheeler stood on her porch like a man with a righteous mission. At 55, he had the weathered face of someone who had spent his life in hard physical labor, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had learned to use other people's fears for his own advantage. Behind him, the other men formed, a loose semicircle, their body language suggesting they were prepared for resistance. "Miss Chen," Tom said, his voice carrying the artificial politeness of barely contained hostility. "We heard you have something that doesn't belong to you." "Good morning, Tom. I have a sick baby who requires medical attention. Nothing more, nothing less." Tom's smile was thin and predatory. "That baby belongs with its family, not with someone who has no business playing doctor. Jake, you need to come to your senses and get that child to a real hospital." "The baby is receiving appropriate care," Margaret replied before Jake could respond. "Moving an infant with respiratory distress in these weather conditions would be medically irresponsible." "Medically irresponsible?" Tom's voice rose slightly. "You're not a doctor, lady. You're a failed mine inspector who got 12 good men killed and has been hiding in the woods ever since. What makes you think you have any business touching that baby?" Margaret felt the familiar shame wash over her, but this time it was accompanied by something stronger. Anger. Pure, clean anger at the injustice of being blamed for corporate negligence, at 5 years of silence in the face of lies, at the assumption that her exile had somehow negated her training and experience. "I'm a former army medic with 8 years of field experience, including pediatric emergency care," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "I'm also the person who has kept that baby alive for the past 12 hours while you were home sleeping." Deputy Rodriguez stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to turn the baby over to Mr. Morrison so he can transport it to proper medical facilities." "The baby stays here until it's medically stable," Margaret said firmly. "And unless you have a warrant, you're trespassing on private property." Tom Wheeler's face flushed red. "Don't you lecture us about the law, lady. We all know what you did to those miners. We all know you signed off on equipment that you knew was faulty. 12 families lost their fathers because of your negligence. And now you want us to trust you with an innocent baby?" The accusation hung in the cold air like a physical blow. Margaret felt Jake step up beside her, his presence a small comfort against the wall of hostility facing them. "The equipment wasn't faulty," Jake said quietly. "The investigation proved that. The explosion was caused by methane gas buildup due to inadequate ventilation systems, systems that Consolidated Mining refused to upgrade despite repeated safety recommendations." Tom Wheeler's eyes narrowed. "That's not what I heard." "Then you heard wrong," said a voice from behind the group. Everyone turned to see Father Miguel Santos walking up the driveway, his long black coat stark against the white snow. The parish priest was a small man with gentle eyes and graying hair, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to mediating between opposing sides. Behind him walked an unexpected ally, Eleanor Whitman, the town librarian and unofficial keeper of Cedar Falls' institutional memory. "Father Santos," Tom Wheeler said warily, "this isn't church business. When the welfare of a child is involved, it becomes everyone's business," the priest replied calmly. "And when a member of my parish is being falsely accused, it becomes my business specifically." Eleanor Whitman stepped forward, her arms full of documents. At 73, she was one of the few people in Cedar Falls who commanded universal respect, largely because she had been the high school principal for 30 years and had taught most of the current adult population at one time or another. "Tom, I have here the complete investigation report from the mine disaster," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the no-nonsense tone she had used to discipline generations of students. "All 847 pages, which I doubt you've ever read. Would you like me to quote the sections that specifically exonerate Margaret of any wrongdoing?" Tom shifted, uncomfortably. Those reports were written by government bureaucrats trying to protect their own. Those reports were written by federal investigators who had no connection to local politics or corporate interests, Eleanor interrupted. "Unlike the rumors and gossip that seem to pass for facts in this town." Father Santos moved closer to the porch, his eyes gentle but determined. "Margaret, may I see the baby?" Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside to allow the priest entry. Jake followed, leaving the group of men standing uncertainly on the porch. Tom Wheeler started to follow, but Eleanor Whitman blocked his path with surprising authority. "You'll wait here, Tom. 6 men crowding around a sick infant is the last thing that child needs." Inside the cabin, Father Santos examined the makeshift medical setup with professional interest. As a former hospital chaplain, he understood enough about medical care to recognize competent treatment when he saw it. "How is the baby?" he asked softly. "Stable but still fragile," Margaret replied. "Respiratory distress syndrome is common in premature infants, but with careful monitoring and supportive care, the prognosis is good. However, any unnecessary stress or sudden changes in environment could trigger complications." The priest nodded, his eyes taking in the careful arrangement of heating pads, humidity controls, and monitoring equipment that Margaret had assembled from household items. "You've done excellent work here. This child is fortunate to have received such skilled care." Jake spoke up from the corner where he had been standing guard over his grandchild. "Father, they want to take the baby away, but Margaret's right. Moving the baby now could be dangerous." "Then the baby will stay here," Father Santos said with quiet finality, "and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Outside, they could hear Tom Wheeler's voice rising in argument with Eleanor Whitman, who was apparently quoting extensively from the mine investigation report in a tone that suggested she was enjoying herself immensely. "Why are you helping us?" Margaret asked the priest, genuinely puzzled. In 5 years of exile, she had received kindness from exactly no one in Cedar Falls. Father Santos smiled sadly. "Because I was here the night after the mine explosion. I watched you sit with every single family, explaining exactly what had happened and what you were doing to prevent it from happening again. I watched you offer to resign your position before anyone asked you to. I watched you weep for men you barely knew because you felt responsible for their safety." He paused, his voice growing softer. "And I watched this town choose convenient lies over uncomfortable truths because it's easier to hate a stranger than to fight a corporation." Margaret felt tears threatening again, but this time they carried as much relief as pain. For 5 years, she had believed herself completely alone in her exile. To discover that someone had been watching, someone had understood, felt like a gift she had never dared hope for. The baby stirred on the table, making soft sounds that indicated hunger. Margaret moved automatically to prepare another feeding. Her movements watched with approval by Father Santos and protective attention by Jake. Outside, Tom Wheeler's voice could be heard demanding that Deputy Rodriguez do his job and arrest someone. But Eleanor Whitman's steady recitation of investigation findings seemed to be undermining his certainty. The sound of engines starting suggested that some of the group were losing enthusiasm for the confrontation. "This isn't over," Margaret said quietly, checking the baby's temperature and adjusting the makeshift incubator. "No," Father Santos agreed, "but it's also not the same as it was this morning. Sometimes change begins with a single act of courage, and sometimes that courage inspires others to remember who they really are." Jake looked from the priest to Margaret to his grandchild, and for the first time since the crisis began, Margaret saw hope in his eyes. The baby's breathing continued to improve, steady and strong, as if responding to the circle of protection that had formed around the makeshift medical station. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, something warmer than shelter was taking root. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, but these came bearing gifts instead of threats. Eleanor Whitman returned with a thermos of homemade soup and a bag of medical supplies she had somehow acquired from Dr. Patterson's clinic. Father Santos brought blankets and a battery-powered radio that would allow them to monitor weather reports. Most surprisingly, 3 women Margaret didn't recognize arrived separately, each leaving packages on the porch without knocking: baby clothes, formula, and what appeared to be home-knitted blankets. "Word is spreading," Jake observed, watching. Another car slow as it passed the driveway. Not all of it bad. Margaret had been monitoring the baby's condition throughout the day, documenting each feeding, each temperature check, each small improvement in breathing patterns. The infant was fighting with a determination that reminded her of the soldiers she had treated in field hospitals, that stubborn refusal to surrender that separated survivors from statistics. "The respiratory distress is definitely improving," she reported to the small group gathered around her kitchen table. "Heart rate is stabilizing, color is good, and the feeding response is strong. But we're still not out of the critical period." Eleanor sorted through the medical supplies with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing crisis situations. "Dr. Patterson sends his regards, by the way. He wanted to come himself, but he's still dealing with Sarah's situation at the clinic." Jake's face tightened. "How is she?" "Stable. She lost more blood than Dr. Patterson would like, but she's young and strong. He expects a full recovery." Eleanor's voice softened. "She's been asking about the baby constantly. Patricia Morrison, Jake's sister, is with her now." Margaret looked up from the baby, surprised. "I didn't know Patricia was back in town." "Drove down from Pittsburgh yesterday when she heard about Sarah," Jake explained. "Patricia's a nurse practitioner at Children's Hospital there. She wanted to come here herself, but..." He gestured helplessly. "But she has a professional reputation to protect," Margaret finished. The unspoken reality was that association with the town pariah could have career consequences, even for family members. Father Santos stood by the window, watching the road with concern. "Tom Wheeler was at Murphy's Tavern an hour ago, trying to convince people that Margaret is holding the baby hostage. He's calling for Sheriff Hendricks to issue some kind of emergency custody order." "On what grounds?" Eleanor demanded. "Margaret is providing medical care that has quite literally saved this child's life." "Since when have Tom Wheeler's accusations required legal grounds?" Jake's voice carried years of frustration. "He's been spreading lies about Margaret for 5 years. Now he has an excuse to escalate." Margaret continued her careful monitoring of the baby, but part of her attention was focused on the conversation swirling around her. For years, she had lived in isolation, believing that her exile was complete and permanent. The discovery that some people had been quietly questioning the official narrative felt both validating and terrifying. Validation meant she hadn't been crazy to maintain her innocence. Terror meant that the comfortable numbness of exile might be ending, forcing her to re-engage with a world that had already broken her once. "Margaret," Eleanor said gently, "there's something you need to know about the mine investigation." Margaret's hands stilled on the baby's blanket. "What do you mean?" Eleanor pulled a thick folder from her bag, setting it on the table with care. "I spent the morning going through the official files again, but I also called some old contacts. At the state level, people who worked on the investigation but weren't part of the final report. Eleanor, I've read the investigation report. I know what it says. You know what the public version says. But there were findings that never made it into the official documentation." Eleanor opened the folder, revealing pages of handwritten notes and photocopied documents. 3 investigators wanted to recommend criminal charges against Consolidated Mining's regional management. They were overruled by federal authorities, who cited national economic interests. Jake leaned forward, his expression intense. "What kind of criminal charges?" "Willful negligence resulting in worker endangerment, falsification of safety records, bribery of state inspectors." Not Margaret, but her predecessor, who had been taking payments to overlook ventilation system failures for over 2 years. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. That's impossible. If there was evidence of criminal activity, why wasn't it prosecuted? Father, Santos answered quietly, because Consolidated Mining was one of the largest employers in 3 counties, because they had lobbyists and lawyers and political connections, because it was easier to let one safety inspector take the blame than to fight a corporation with unlimited resources. The baby made a soft sound, drawing Margaret's attention back to immediate concerns. She checked the temperature, adjusted the humidity levels, and noted the improvement in skin color, but her mind was reeling from Eleanor's revelations. "Why are you telling me this now?" Margaret asked. Eleanor's eyes were kind but determined. "Because Tom Wheeler's campaign against you is escalating, and you deserve to know the truth. But also because this baby's situation has reminded people that sometimes doing the right thing requires standing up to bullies, whether they're mine corporations or town loudmouths." A truck pulled into the driveway, and everyone tensed until they recognized Patricia Morrison getting out of the driver's seat. Jake's sister was a tall, competent-looking woman in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the calm confidence of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. Patricia knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, her trained eyes immediately assessing the makeshift medical setup. Margaret watched as the nurse practitioner took in the temperature controls, humidity systems, feeding schedule charts, and monitoring logs with obvious approval. "Impressive work," Patricia said, after completing her examination of both the baby and Margaret's documentation. "This is exactly the kind of supportive care I would recommend for a premature infant with respiratory distress. The baby's condition has improved significantly since yesterday." "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "But I'm concerned about the long-term prognosis. Without proper medical equipment, if there are complications..." "There's a neonatal transport team at Charleston General," Patricia said. "But honestly, given the weather conditions and the baby's current stability, I think continuing care here is the safest option for at least another 24 hours. Jake looked relieved. "So Margaret's been doing the right thing." Margaret has been doing exceptional work under difficult circumstances. This baby is alive because of her skill and dedication. Patricia's voice carried professional authority that would be difficult for anyone to challenge. Anyone suggesting otherwise is either ignorant or motivated by factors other than the baby's welfare. As if summoned by her words, they heard vehicles approaching again. This time, it was Sheriff Hendricks in his official patrol car, followed by Tom Wheeler and 2 other men Margaret didn't recognize. Father Santos sighed. Round 2. Sheriff Hendricks was a different proposition than his deputy. At 62, he had been elected sheriff for 24 years on a platform of fairness and common sense. He was also one of the few people in Cedar Falls who had publicly questioned the rush to blame Margaret for the mine disaster, though he had stopped short of actively defending her. Margaret opened the door before he could knock. "Sheriff Hendricks." "Miss Jen, I understand you're providing medical care for a baby." "I am. And I understand there's some dispute about whether the baby should be moved to a hospital." Margaret gestured toward Patricia, who stepped forward with professional composure. "Sheriff, I'm Patricia Morrison, nurse practitioner at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. I've examined both the baby and the care being provided. In my professional opinion, this infant is receiving appropriate medical treatment and should not be moved until its condition is more stable." Sheriff Hendricks nodded thoughtfully. "And how long might that be?" "At least 24 hours, possibly longer depending on how the baby responds to treatment." Tom Wheeler pushed past the sheriff, his face red with frustration. "This is ridiculous. That woman has no business playing doctor with Jake's grandchild. The baby belongs in a real hospital with real doctors." "The baby belongs wherever it receives the best possible care," Patricia replied calmly. Right now, that happens to be here. Says who? You're his aunt. You're not exactly objective. Says my 8 years of pediatric intensive care. Experience and my professional medical license. Patricia shot back. What are your qualifications for making medical decisions about premature infants? Sheriff Hendricks held up a hand for silence. Miss Chen, may I see the baby? Margaret led him inside, followed by Patricia and Father Santos. Jake positioned himself protectively near the makeshift incubator while Eleanor continued to sort through her documentation like a lawyer preparing for trial. The sheriff examined the setup with careful attention, asking detailed questions about temperature control, feeding schedules, and monitoring protocols. Margaret answered with scientific precision, aware that she was being tested not just for competence, but for sanity. This is quite sophisticated, the sheriff observed. You've essentially created a functional neonatal care unit from household supplies. I had good training, Margaret replied simply. Sheriff Hendricks studied her face for a long moment. Yes, you did. I remember reading about your military service when you applied for the mine inspector position. 8 years as a combat medic, including specialized training in pediatric emergency care. Commendations for valor in Iraq and Afghanistan. Margaret was surprised. Most people in Cedar Falls knew nothing about her background beyond her role in the mine disaster. The question before me, the sheriff continued, is whether the baby is receiving appropriate care and whether moving it would be in the child's best interests. Based on what I've seen here and based on the professional opinion of a licensed nurse practitioner, I'm satisfied that the current arrangement is appropriate. Tom Wheeler's face flushed purple. You can't be serious. This woman killed 12 minors. This woman was cleared of any wrongdoing by a federal investigation, Sheriff Hendricks interrupted. And right now, she appears to be saving the life of Jake Morrison's grandchild. Unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing, I suggest you focus your energy on something more productive. As the sheriff prepared to leave, he turned back to Margaret. Miss Chen, if you need anything, medical supplies, transportation assistance, anything at all, you call the sheriff's office directly. That baby's welfare is my only concern in this matter. After the official vehicles departed, the cabin fell into thoughtful silence. The baby slept peacefully in its makeshift incubator, breathing steadily and deeply. But Margaret felt the weight of what had just occurred settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. What happens now? She asked quietly. Father Santos smiled. Now you discover that exile ends when people stop choosing to see you as exiled. But Margaret knew it wouldn't be that simple. Tom Wheeler's hostility hadn't disappeared. It had only been temporarily, contained by official authority and professional competence. The real test would come when the baby was strong enough to leave, when the immediate crisis was over and the town had to decide what version of Margaret Chen they were willing to accept. Looking down at the sleeping infant, Margaret realized that her own fate had become inextricably linked with this tiny stranger's survival. She had opened her door to save a baby's life, but in doing so, she might have unknowingly opened the door to reclaiming her own. The second night brought a fever. Margaret woke from a brief doze in her chair to find the baby's skin burning hot. To the touch, tiny chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths that spoke of distress. The makeshift thermometer she had fashioned from a meat thermometer and careful calibration showed 102.3 degrees, dangerously high for an infant barely 2 days old. Jake, she called softly, not wanting to startle the sleeping man, but needing his help immediately. Wake up! We have a problem! Jake was instantly alert, the protective instincts of new grandfatherhood overriding exhaustion. One look at Margaret's face told him everything he needed to know. How bad? He asked, moving to the baby's side. Bad enough. Fever in premature infants can indicate serious infection, and infection can lead to sepsis very quickly. Margaret was already moving, gathering supplies, adjusting the makeshift incubator's cooling systems. We need to bring the temperature down carefully while figuring out what's causing it. She worked with practiced efficiency, using cool cloths to reduce the baby's temperature while monitoring vital signs. But even as she focused on immediate care, part of her mind was calculating odds and distances. Charleston General was still 3 hours away under good conditions, and the roads were still treacherous from the storm. If this was bacterial infection, the baby would need antibiotics that Margaret simply didn't have access to. Should I call? Patricia, Jake asked, watching anxiously as Margaret adjusted and readjusted the babies. Environment? Yes. And Father Santos. If this gets worse, we're going to need help making some very difficult decisions. Jake stepped outside to use his cell phone, leaving Margaret alone with the fevering infant. In the quiet of the pre-dawn darkness, she found herself talking to the baby in the soft, nonsensical murmur she had used with wounded soldiers who were too young and too scared to die so far from home. Come on, little one. You've been fighting so hard. Don't give up on us now. The baby's eyes opened briefly, dark and unfocused, but somehow aware. Margaret felt that familiar tightening in her chest that came when a patient moved from being a medical case to being a person whose survival mattered on a level that had nothing to do with professional duty. Patricia arrived within 30 minutes, followed shortly by Father Santos and, surprisingly, Dr. Patterson himself. The town's only physician was a gruff man in his 70s who'd been delivering babies and treating everything from broken bones to heart attacks for over 4 decades. His presence at Margaret's cabin was both reassuring and ominous. It meant he took the situation seriously enough to risk his own professional reputation. "Let me see what we're dealing with," Dr. Patterson said without preamble, his experienced hands immediately beginning a thorough examination of the baby. Margaret watched anxiously as he checked reflexes, listened to heart and lung sounds, and palpated the tiny abdomen for signs of distress. "The fever is concerning," he said after several minutes, "but the baby is responding to stimulation. Breathing is still adequate, and I don't see signs of severe distress. This could be a normal immune response to stress, or it could be the beginning of something more serious." "What are our options?" Margaret asked. Dr. Patterson looked at her with a respect that surprised her. "In a hospital setting, we would start broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately and monitor blood work for signs of infection. Here our options are more limited. I have some basic antibiotics in my emergency kit," Patricia offered. "Amoxicillin, which is safe for infants. It's not ideal without knowing what we're fighting, but it's better than nothing," Dr. Patterson agreed. "The real question is whether we try to transport to Charleston or continue supportive care here." Before anyone could answer, they heard vehicles approaching, multiple engines moving fast. Through the window, Margaret could see headlights cutting through the darkness, at least 4 vehicles forming a convoy up her driveway. "What now?" Jake muttered, but his question was answered when Tom Wheeler's voice boomed through a bullhorn outside. "Margaret Chen, this has gone far enough. That baby is dying because of your arrogance, and we're not going to let you kill another innocent person." Father Santos moved to the window, his face grim. "There are at least a dozen people out there, and they don't look like they're here to negotiate." Dr. Patterson's jaw tightened. "These fools are going to get that baby killed with their stupidity. Moving a fevering infant in the middle of the night in these conditions could trigger a medical crisis." Margaret felt the familiar despair washing over her, but this time it was mixed with something fiercer, rage at the thought that ignorance and prejudice might succeed in harming the child she had fought so hard to save. "I'll go talk to them," she said, but Patricia grabbed her arm. "You can't. They're not here to listen to reason. Look at them." Through the window, they could see the crowd gathering around Tom Wheeler. Some carried flashlights, others had baseball bats or tire irons. This wasn't a concerned group of citizens. This was a mob, fueled by years of misdirected anger and given permission to act by the crisis of a fevering baby. Margaret Chen, Tom Wheeler's amplified voice cut through the night again. You have 5 minutes to bring that baby out here, or we're coming in to get it. Jake moved toward the door, his face set with determination. I'll handle this. That's my grandchild. They're threatening. No, Dr. Patterson said firmly. You go out there and they'll claim you're being held against your will or manipulated somehow. This situation requires a different approach. Margaret looked at the baby, whose fever seemed to be responding to the cooling measures, but who remained dangerously fragile. Then she looked at the circle of people who had risked their own reputations to stand with her. Jake, Patricia, Father, Santos, Eleanor, Dr. Patterson. For 5 years, she had believed herself completely alone. Now, when everything was at stake, she had somehow assembled a family of choice around a kitchen table that had become a battlefield. There's something you all need to know, Margaret said quietly, before I make any decisions about what happens next. The room fell silent except for the baby's soft breathing and the muffled voices of the crowd outside. The mine disaster. Eleanor showed you the documents proving I wasn't responsible, but there's more. Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. The real reason I never fought back against the accusations, never tried to clear my name publicly. Father Santos leaned forward. What do you mean? 3 days before the explosion, I submitted a report recommending immediate shutdown of the pending safety upgrades. It was my 3rd report in 6 months, each one more urgent than the last. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. My supervisor buried the report, said if I filed it officially, I'd be terminated for exceeding my authority. Jake's face went pale. So you knew something was wrong. I knew the ventilation system was inadequate. I knew methane levels were building to dangerous concentrations. I knew that without immediate action, there would be an accident. The words poured out of Margaret like water from a broken dam. What I didn't know was how to fight a system designed to protect corporate profits over human lives. Dr. Patterson's voice was gentle. Why didn't you come forward with this during the investigation? Because 3 men had died in my unit in Afghanistan when I couldn't convince my commanding officer to change a patrol route I knew was dangerous, because I had spent my entire adult life failing to save people when the system wouldn't listen to safety warnings. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks, because I was tired of being the person who knew disasters were coming but couldn't prevent them. The bullhorn crackled outside again. 3 minutes, Margaret Chen! 3 minutes or we're coming in! Father Santos stood up, his small frame somehow commanding attention. Margaret, you saved my nephew Danny Morrison in Afghanistan. You tried to save 12 miners in Cedar Falls. You've spent the last 2 days saving Jake's grandchild. The common thread isn't failure. It's that you never stop fighting for other people's lives. Even when the system is rigged against you, Patricia added, even when speaking up costs you everything. Eleanor pulled another document from her seemingly endless supply of papers. This is a copy of your last safety report to Consolidated Mining. I found it in the state archives. You were right about everything. The methane levels, the ventilation inadequacy, the timeline for catastrophic failure. Margaret stared at the document she thought had been buried forever. How did you? Because someone in the state regulatory office thought it was important enough to preserve, even when their superiors wanted it forgotten. Eleanor's voice carried fierce pride. Because some people do listen, even when they can't act immediately. The baby stirred on the table, making soft sounds that indicated consciousness. Margaret checked the temperature, still elevated, but lower than before. The fever was responding to treatment, but the infant remained fragile. 2 minutes! Tom Wheeler's voice was getting closer, suggesting the crowd was moving toward the cabin. Jake looked at Margaret with new understanding. You could have saved yourself 5 years ago by telling this story. Why didn't you? Margaret touched the baby's tiny hand, feeling the small fingers instinctively grasp her own. Because telling the story wouldn't have brought those 12 men back to their families. Because being right about a disaster that kills people doesn't feel like vindication. But staying silent allowed lies to become truth, Father Santos said gently, and lies have a way of growing until they swallow innocent people. Like this baby. Like you. Outside, footsteps were approaching the cabin. Flashlight beams swept. Across the windows, voices rose in preparation for action. Margaret stood up, decision crystallizing in her mind with sudden clarity. For 5 years, she had chosen silence over conflict, isolation over engagement, safety over truth. But looking at the baby who depended on her care, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her despite the cost, she realized that some battles couldn't be won by retreating. "Dr. Patterson," she said quietly, "if I go outside to face them, will you and Patricia continue monitoring the baby?" "Margaret, you can't," Jake started. "Yes, I can, and I have to." Margaret's voice carried a strength that surprised even her. Because that crowd isn't really angry about the baby. They're angry about 12 men who died 5 years ago. And they're angry because they've never had anyone to blame who would fight back. She moved toward the door, but Father Santos blocked her path. "You don't have to do this alone." Margaret smiled, feeling something like peace settling over her, despite the chaos outside. "I know that's what makes it impossible." The moment of truth had arrived, not just for the fevering baby, but for a woman who had spent 5 years learning the difference between hiding from fight and choosing your battles carefully. Margaret opened the door and stepped onto her porch, facing the crowd that had gathered to demand answers she had been afraid to give for 5 years. The night air cut through her thin sweater, but she felt calmer than she had since the day 12 miners died in an explosion she had tried to prevent. Tom Wheeler stood at the front of the group, bullhorn in one hand, flashlight in the other. Behind him, she recognized faces from town, some angry, some uncertain, all afraid of something they didn't understand. But looking at them now, Margaret realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Fear required having something left to lose. "Tom," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air without need for amplification. "You want to talk? Let's talk." "We're done talking," Tom shouted. "That baby is dying because of your arrogance, and we're not going to let you—" "The baby has a fever," Margaret interrupted, her voice steady and professional. "It's being treated by Dr. Patterson and Patricia Morrison, both of whom are infinitely more qualified than anyone in this crowd to make medical decisions. The fever is responding to treatment, and moving the baby right now could trigger a life-threatening crisis." "You're not a doctor," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "No, I'm not. I'm a former army medic with 8 years of field experience, including pediatric emergency care. I'm also a former mine safety inspector who tried to prevent the deaths of 12 good men and was silenced by a corporation that valued profits over lives." The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't the script they had expected. Eleanor Whitman stepped out of the cabin behind Margaret, carrying her folder of documents. "I have here the complete investigation files from the mine disaster, including Margaret's safety reports that were buried by Consolidated Mining, reports that predicted exactly what happened and recommended immediate shutdown to prevent it." "Those are lies," Tom Wheeler's voice cracked slightly. "Government cover-ups trying to protect their own people." Father Santos emerged from the cabin, followed by Dr. Patterson. The sight of the town's respected physician clearly choosing sides had a visible impact on the crowd's certainty. "Tom," Dr. Patterson said quietly, "I've examined that baby. Margaret Chen's medical care has been exemplary. That child is alive because of her skill and dedication. What about the 12 men who died because of her? Tom's voice was desperate now, his certainty crumbling in the face of mounting evidence. Margaret stepped forward, close enough that Tom could see her face clearly in the flashlight beams. Those 12 men died because I failed to convince my supervisors that corporate safety regulations were inadequate. They died because I didn't have the courage to file official reports that would have cost me my job. They died because I chose my career security over their lives. The crowd fell silent, unprepared for this level of honesty. But they didn't die because I was incompetent or negligent or malicious. They died because a system designed to protect corporate interests silenced the people whose job it was to protect workers. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. And for 5 years, I let this town blame me for corporate crimes because I was too broken by guilt to fight back. Jake Morrison stepped out of the cabin, positioning himself beside Margaret. She's telling the truth. I've seen the buried reports, the real investigation findings. Margaret Chen tried to save my brother Danny in Afghanistan, tried to save those miners in Cedar Falls, and has spent the last 2 days saving my grandchild. Patricia appeared in the doorway, her medical authority clear in her posture and voice. I'm a pediatric nurse practitioner at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. The care this baby has received here is better than what many hospital emergency rooms could have provided under these circumstances. Anyone suggesting otherwise is either ignorant or motivated by something other than the child's welfare. Tom Wheeler looked around desperately, seeking support from a crowd that was beginning to fragment. Some people were backing away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation was taking. Others were stepping forward, eager to hear more truth after years of convenient lies. This is all very touching, Tom said, his voice heavy with sarcasm that couldn't quite hide his desperation. But it doesn't change the fact that Margaret Chen has been hiding from this community for 5 years, playing the victim while good people suffered. Good people suffered because a mining corporation chose profits over safety. Eleanor Whitman replied firmly, good people suffered because some residents of this town found it easier to blame a convenient scapegoat than to fight for justice against powerful interests. Margaret looked at Tom Wheeler, seeing not an enemy but a man who had spent 5 years carrying anger that had nowhere else to go. Tom, I know you lost friends in that explosion. I know you need someone to blame. For 5 years, I let you blame me because I thought I deserved it. But hiding from blame doesn't serve justice, and it doesn't honor the memory of good men who died. She gestured toward the cabin behind her. Right now, there's a baby in there who needs medical care. Dr. Patterson and Patricia Morrison are providing that care. When the baby is stable enough to travel safely, it will go to a hospital for continued treatment. Until then, anyone who tries to interfere with medical care is endangering an infant's life. A woman Margaret didn't recognize stepped forward from the crowd. My husband worked in that mine. He was one of the lucky ones who was on different shift rotation that day. He always said the safety warnings were being ignored, that someone was going to get killed. Another voice spoke up from the back. My brother-in-law was on the investigation team. He said the real report was buried, that someone higher up made sure the blame fell on the inspector instead of the company. Tom Wheeler looked around frantically as his support continued to evaporate. You're all being manipulated. She's turning you against your own community. No, said a quiet voice from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see Sarah Morrison, pale and moving carefully but determined. Jake's daughter had somehow convinced someone to drive her from the clinic, despite medical advice to rest. She's saving my baby's life, while the rest of us stand around arguing about things that happened 5 years ago. Sarah walked slowly toward the cabin, supported by a woman Margaret recognized as one of the nurses from Dr. Patterson's clinic. I don't care about mine explosions or corporate conspiracies or who's been hiding from what. I care about my baby and the woman who's been taking care of it when no one else could. She stopped in front of Margaret, tears streaming down her young face. Thank you. Whatever else happens, thank you for not letting my baby die." Margaret felt her own tears starting, but they were different from the tears of guilt and shame. She had shed for 5 years. These carried relief and gratitude and something that felt remarkably like hope. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat. "The baby's fever has broken. Temperature is back to normal. Breathing is stable, and all indicators suggest full recovery. Margaret's care has been textbook perfect." A cheer went up from parts of the crowd, while others began to disperse quietly. Tom Wheeler stood alone with his bullhorn, his anger suddenly looking petty and misplaced in the face of a baby's recovery and a community's awakening to truth. Father Santos stepped forward. "Tom, it's over. The baby is safe, the truth is out, and it's time to let healing begin." Tom looked around at the faces that were no longer listening to him, at the evidence he could no longer deny, at the reality that his 5-year campaign had been built on lies. For a moment, Margaret thought he might continue fighting. Then his shoulders sagged, and he turned away without another word. In the days that followed, Cedar Falls began to remember what community actually meant. People brought food and supplies to Margaret's cabin without being asked. Children who had been taught to fear the witch in the woods discovered a gentle woman who knew how to fix injured birds and explain how things worked. Sarah Morrison recovered fully and became a regular visitor, bringing her healthy baby to visit the woman who had saved both their lives. The story spread beyond Cedar Falls, picked up by regional newspapers and eventually reaching investigators who had been quietly pursuing corporate accountability for years. Eleanor Whitman's meticulously preserved documents became evidence in a federal case that ultimately resulted in criminal charges against Consolidated Mining executives. Margaret never returned to work as a mine inspector, but she did return to medicine. With Dr. Patterson's encouragement and the community's support, she established a small clinic in Cedar Falls that specialized in emergency care and served the rural communities that had been medically underserved for decades. Jake Morrison became one of her staunchest supporters, often joking that his granddaughter had inherited her fighting spirit from the woman who first taught her to breathe. The baby, named Hope Elizabeth Morrison, grew up knowing that sometimes the most important doors are the ones we're afraid to open. 6 months after that cold February night, Margaret stood in her new clinic, watching through the window as children played in the town square where she had once been unwelcome. Her past would always carry the weight of 12 miners' deaths, but she had learned that carrying grief was different from carrying blame. Sometimes, redemption comes not from forgetting the past, but from finally finding the courage to tell the truth about it. Sometimes healing begins when we stop hiding from the people who need us most. And sometimes the very act of opening our doors transforms not just our own lives, but the entire community waiting outside. The door Margaret had opened on a desperate winter night had become a bridge between isolation and belonging, between shame and healing, between the person she had been and the person she was meant to become. In saving one tiny life, she had discovered that her own life was worth saving too. As Hope Morrison took her first steps in the town square, laughing with the pure joy of someone who had never known fear, Margaret smiled and thought about the power of small beginnings and second chances. In a world where we often feel disconnected from our neighbors and overwhelmed by problems too big for any one person to solve, Hope's story reminds us that extraordinary change can begin with a single act of courage. Whether it's helping a neighbor in crisis, speaking truth in the face of comfortable lies, or simply opening our door when someone needs shelter, each of us has the power to write stories of redemption. If this story of hope, healing, and community, courage moved you, consider sharing it with someone who might need reminding that no one is beyond redemption and no community is beyond healing. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply bear witness to the truth that love and justice can triumph over fear and prejudice, one open door at a time.